You have looked for something while you were holding it. Maybe it was your phone. You were patting your pockets, scanning the table, retracing your steps through the kitchen, and the phone was in your hand the entire time. Maybe it was your glasses, pushed up onto your head while you searched the desk for them. Maybe it was your keys, which you finally found in the same hand you've been using to pull open every drawer in the house. Whatever it was, you know the moment I'm describing, because almost everyone alive has lived it more than once. And there's a very particular feeling in that moment. It isn't quite embarrassment, though embarrassment is in the neighborhood. It's stranger than that. It's a small vertigo, a brief tilt in the floor, the disorientation of realizing that the thing you were searching for was never actually missing. It was closer than the search itself. It was right up against you the whole time. The problem was never where it was. The problem was the way you were looking. I want to slow down on that feeling, because it's more interesting than it first appears, and because the whole of what we're going to talk about today turns on it. When the keys are already in your hand, no amount of searching the room will ever find them. You can be thorough. You can be patient. You can be completely sincere. You can take the cushions off the couch and check behind the books and go back through your coat pockets a third time. And none of it will work, not because you're searching badly, but because the entire activity of searching contains a hidden assumption. It assumes the thing is out there, somewhere not here, somewhere that isn't this hand, this body, this exact spot you're standing in. The search has the thing's absence built into it before you take the first step. And so the more honestly you search, the more thoroughly you confirm to yourself that what you want is somewhere you are not. Roughly 2,000 years ago, someone wrote down a collection of sayings attributed to Jesus. And one of the very first sayings in that collection is more or less about exactly this. It's about people who are told to look up at the sky for the thing they most want, or out across the sea towards some far horizon, and who therefore never find it because it was never in the sky and never in the sea. It was, the saying claims, inside them. And also, in the same breath, already all around them, spread out, in the plainest possible language across the ordinary world they walk through every single day without ever once noticing it was there. That collection is called the Gospel of Thomas. It is not in your Bible. For most of the last 2,000 years, no living person had read it. It was lost, condemned, buried, and forgotten, so completely that for centuries scholars knew it only as a name in a few ancient lists of banned books. And what it says about the thing it calls the kingdom is genuinely not what most people assume Jesus meant when he used that word. So I want to actually read it with you today. Not the version of it that's been passed through 3 or 4 layers of other people's certainty until it comes out smooth and confident and frankly a little too neat. The actual text, what we know about where it came from, what careful people who've spent their lives on it agree about, and just as importantly, what they still argue about. And then what it might be pointing at for you in an ordinary week of an ordinary life. You don't have to believe a word of it. I'm not going to tell you what you are or hand you a flattering secret about your hidden nature. I'm going to show you what the text says as honestly as I can, and then we'll see together what's actually worth carrying out of it. But to do any of that, you have to know where this thing came from, and that story alone is worth telling carefully because it's one of the strangest accidents in the history of religion. In December of 1945, in the south of Egypt, near a town called Nag Hammadi, a farmer was digging at the base of a cliff. His name in most accounts was Muhammad Ali al-Saman. And he wasn't digging for treasure. He was digging for soft earth, the nitrate-rich soil that people in that region used to fertilize their fields. It was ordinary work. And then his tool struck something solid in the ground against the cliff face. A large clay jar, sealed, almost a meter tall, buried there and waiting. The story he told afterward has a hesitation in it that I find very human and very telling. He didn't want to open the jar at first. There was a fear that something might come out of it, a spirit, a jinn, some sealed thing better left sealed. But there was also a competing hope, the much more practical and earthly hope that the jar might be full of gold. And in the end, as he told it, the hope of gold won out over the fear of the Spirit, and he broke the jar open against the ground. There was no gold. Instead, inside there were books, 13 of them. Leather-bound codices, their pages made of papyrus written in a language he couldn't read, which turned out to be Coptic, the very last living form of the ancient Egyptian language, written down using Greek letters. He had no idea what they were. They were just old books, and old books were not gold, and so they had no obvious value to him. He carried them home, and by most accounts dumped them in a pile near the oven. And here is the detail that should make anyone who loves the written word physically wince. Some of those pages were burned. The account that comes down to us is that his mother used some of the loose papyrus as kindling, as fuel for the fire, to bake bread or boil water. We will never know exactly how much was lost that way. Pages of texts that no one had read in over 1,000 years gone to light a cooking fire. Because to the people holding them, they were worth less than firewood. What survived that winter? What wasn't burned then began a long and complicated journey. The books were traded away, often for very little. They passed through the hands of local people, then antiquities dealers, then the black market, then eventually scholars and museums. One of the codices was smuggled out of Egypt entirely and ended up in Europe before being purchased and returned. There was even woven through this period a genuine blood feud and a revenge killing in the farmer's own family, which complicated his ability to deal with the books for fear of the authorities. The whole thing reads less like the careful recovery of priceless manuscripts and more like a thriller with a body count. But slowly, over years, the surviving material was gathered, mostly into the Coptic Museum in Cairo, and scholars began the long work of figuring out what exactly had been found. What they had found turned out to be one of the most important manuscript discoveries of the entire 20th century. We call it the Nag Hammadi Library, after the town near where it was dug up. It's a collection of more than 50 separate texts bound into those 13 books, and most of them had not been read by a single living person for something like 1,600 years. They were Christian writings, broadly speaking, but they were the writings that lost Gospels, revelations, dialogues, prayers, and treatises that did not make it into the official New Testament, and that in many cases were actively hunted down and destroyed as heresy in the centuries after they were composed. Someone, probably sometime in the late 4th century, gathered these books up and buried them in that jar against the cliff. And the most likely reason is the simplest one. They were hiding them, because to be caught with them had become dangerous. So they sealed them in clay and put them in the ground, and there they stayed through the rise and fall of empires until a farmer looking for fertilizer found them by pure chance. The second text in the second of those 13 books is the one we are here for. It is the Gospel of Thomas. Now, I want to be careful with you and slow, because this is exactly the point where a lot of content about this material goes wrong, and I'd rather lose your attention being accurate than keep it being thrilling and false. The Gospel of Thomas is not a story. That alone makes it strange to anyone who grew up with the New Testament. There is no birth in a manger. There are no miracles, no walking on water, no feeding of the crowds. There is no journey to Jerusalem, no Last Supper, no betrayal, no crucifixion, no empty tomb, no resurrection. None of the narrative architecture that you think of when you think of a gospel is present. What you have instead is a list. 114 sayings, one after another, most of them introduced with the same 3 words, repeated over and over down the length of the text. Jesus said. That's it. That's the form scholars call this kind of document a sayings gospel. And it sits much closer in its shape to an ancient book of wisdom or a collection of riddles than to the 4 narrative gospels most people know. The text introduces itself in its opening lines by claiming that these are the hidden or secret sayings that the living Jesus spoke, and that they were written down by someone called Didymos Judas Thomas. And there's a small puzzle even in that name. Didymos is the Greek word for twin. Thomas comes from the Aramaic word for twin. So the name embedded right at the front of this gospel is, when you unpack it, something like Judas the twin. The twin of whom the text doesn't say outright, though later traditions ran in some remarkable directions with that question. imagining a kind of spiritual twinship between this Judas Thomas and Jesus himself. I mention it not to send you down that particular road, but to show you this early that the text rewards slow reading. The strangeness is there from the first line. Here is the first thing we genuinely do not know, and I'd rather hand it to you straight than pretend the question is settled. We do not know when the Gospel of Thomas was written. The physical copy that was pulled out of that jar, the Coptic one, dates to around the 4th century. But the text it's a copy of is older than the copy, and it was not originally composed in Coptic at all. It was composed in Greek. And we know that for an interesting reason that connects two completely separate Egyptian discoveries across half a century, decades before Nag Hammadi. Back around the turn of the 20th century, archaeologists working at a different Egyptian site, an ancient rubbish heap near a place called Oxyrhynchus, dug up enormous quantities of papyrus fragments. Among the thousands of scraps were a handful of fragments containing sayings of Jesus, in Greek, that didn't quite match anything in the known Gospels. Nobody at the time could identify what larger work they belonged to. They were tantalizing orphans, sayings without a home, and for decades they sat in that uncertain state. Then Nag Hammadi happened, and the full Gospel of Thomas surfaced in Coptic, and scholars compared the two. And the realization landed. Those orphaned Greek fragments from Oxyrhynchus were pieces of Thomas. They were the original language, the older form of the same gospel. Suddenly the fragments had a home, and the Coptic gospel had a Greek ancestor. And the existence of both let scholars start asking how the text had changed between them. So, how old is the underlying composition? Here is where the experts genuinely and seriously divide, and I want you to actually feel the shape of the disagreement, because the answer matters enormously for how you weigh everything else. Some scholars argue that parts of Thomas are very early, possibly as early as the first written Gospels themselves, drawn from an independent stream of the Jesus tradition that didn't simply copy from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. On this view, Thomas might preserve, in places, very old material, perhaps as old as anything in the New Testament. Stephen Patterson has argued along these lines, and the late Helmut Koester was an influential voice for the early independent dating. Other scholars push back hard and argue that Thomas is a later work, 2nd century, and that it knows the canonical Gospels well and reworks them for its own purposes. Mark Goodacre has made a detailed and forceful case that Thomas shows signs of familiarity with the Gospels we already had, which would make it a later interpreter rather than an independent witness. And then there's a position in between, associated especially with April de Connick, who has proposed that we shouldn't even be asking for a single date, because the text grew over time. On her model, Thomas is like a rolling corpus, a community's evolving collection, with an early core of sayings that later generations added to, layer by layer, the way sediment builds up. If that's right, then asking when was Thomas written is a little like asking when a coral reef was built. I cannot resolve that for you, and I'm not going to pretend to. Anyone who tells you with total confidence that they know the date of the Gospel of Thomas in either direction is telling you more than the evidence allows. What we can responsibly say is this: it is a serious ancient Christian text. Careful and intelligent people have spent entire careers arguing about its origins, and some real and well-credentialed scholars believe that buried in it, at least in places, may be very early material. That is enough. That is plenty, actually. We do not need to inflate it into more than it is to find it worth reading. And there's one more piece of honesty I owe you before we open the text itself, and it has to do with the name of this channel and with what you might reasonably expect me to claim. You might expect me, at this point, to tell you that the Gospel of Thomas is a Gnostic gospel full of the whole elaborate machinery, the false creator God, the fallen divine wisdom, the layered heavens, the prison world built to trap sparks of light. And I'm not going to tell you that, because the honest answer is that Thomas mostly does not contain any of that. The full Gnostic cosmology that you find in some of the other texts from Nag Hammadi is, by and large, simply not present in Thomas. There's no demiurge in it. There's no fall of Sophia narrated in it. There are no named rulers of the lower world. Because of this, A great many scholars now actively resist calling Thomas Gnostic at all, or call it Gnostic only with heavy qualifications. It's better described, most would say, as a wisdom text with a strong mystical streak, a text intensely preoccupied with self-knowledge and with the idea of seeing what is hidden in plain sight. So when we read it together, we are going to read what is actually on the page, and only what is actually on the page, and we are not going to smuggle in a whole system that the text itself does not teach. That restraint, honestly, is the entire reason this channel exists. Alright, with that ground firmly under us, let's read the saying that everything turns on. Here is saying number 3. I'll give it to you the way I'd render it from the Coptic, kept deliberately plain with no decoration. Jesus said, "If those who lead you say to you, 'Look, the kingdom is in the sky,' then the birds of the sky will get there before you. If they say to you, 'It is in the sea,' then the fish will get there before you. Rather, the kingdom is inside you and it is outside you. When you come to know yourselves, then you will be known and you will understand that you are children of the living Father. But if you do not come to know yourselves, then you live in poverty, and you are that poverty." I want to take that apart slowly, because nearly every clause in it is doing real work. And the popular versions of this saying tend to grab one shiny piece and drop the rest. Start with who is being criticized in the opening line. Those who lead you. That's not vague. The leaders, the teachers, the religious authorities, the people whose entire role is to tell ordinary people where to find God and how to get there. And the saying's very first move is to put those guides in the wrong. They are pointing in the wrong direction. They say the kingdom is in the sky, which is exactly where most of the ancient world located the divine, up above the dome of heaven, in the realm of the gods. Or they say it's out across the sea, the far horizon, the distant elsewhere. And the saying answers this with a kind of dry logical joke. If the kingdom were up in the sky, then the birds, who are already up there, would obviously beat you to it. If it were down in the sea, then the fish would be there ahead of you. The whole premise is gently ridiculed. To locate the kingdom in any place is to imply that whatever already lives in that place has a head start on you. The image is absurd on purpose. The point being driven home is that the kingdom is not a location. It is not somewhere you can travel toward. Putting it anywhere on a map is already the mistake. Then comes the pivot, the line everyone knows, or thinks they know. Rather, the kingdom is inside you and it is outside you. And I need you to notice that it is both. This is precisely where the popular readings stop too early and lose the whole thing. They seize on the inside you half, because by itself it sounds reassuringly like modern self-help. The divine is within. Look no further than your own heart. You already have everything you need. But the text does not let you rest there. In the very same breath it adds, and it is outside you. The kingdom has not simply been relocated, moved from the sky down into your chest like swapping one address for another. It is inside and outside at once, which is the text's careful way of telling you to stop thinking in terms of inside and outside altogether, to stop thinking in terms of where. The inside you is not the answer. The inside you and outside you together are the answer. And the answer is that the question of location was wrong from the start. Now, some of you already know that there's a line in the Gospel of Luke that sounds almost exactly like this. And it's worth pausing on, because the comparison reveals something genuinely interesting that most people never hear about. In Luke chapter 17, the Pharisees ask Jesus when the kingdom of God is coming. And he tells them it isn't coming with signs you can observe. You won't be able to point and say, here it is or there it is. And then he says the famous phrase, in Greek, that phrase is entos haimon. And those two little words are among the most genuinely debated words in the entire New Testament. Because entos can mean within. The kingdom of God is within you, inside you, as the old King James Version famously translated it. But entos can also mean among or in the midst of. The kingdom of God is among you, in your midst, right here between you, already walking around in your company. And here is the thing that surprises people. Many modern scholarly translations actually lean toward the second reading. Among you, or in your midst, rather than within you? Part of the reasoning is that Jesus is saying this line to his opponents, the Pharisees, the people he's arguing with, and the kingdom of God is inside you people is a strange and almost incoherent thing to say to a group you're in the middle of criticizing. The kingdom is right here among you and you can't see it fits the confrontation much better. So that single ambiguous phrase has been quietly fought over for centuries. Within versus among, and your translation choice changes the meaning considerably. And now look back at Thomas with that in mind, because this is the first genuinely new thing I want you to walk away with today. Luke hands you one ambiguous phrase and forces you to choose within or among, inside the person, or here in the midst. Thomas refuses to choose. Saying 3 says both openly and deliberately, inside you and outside you. It is as if Thomas had already thought hard about exactly the ambiguity that the Luke translators are still stuck arguing over, and resolved it not by picking a side, but by keeping both halves at once. Whatever the historical relationship between these two texts turns out to be, and that's its own unresolved debate, Thomas reads here like a document that has stared directly at this puzzle and answered it by holding both meanings together. The kingdom is not located inside you and it is not located out among you. It is both, which is the text's way of saying it is beyond the whole grammar of location. So the famous kingdom within idea is not Thomas making a cozy little point about your inner life and your private spirituality. It is one half of a deliberate, two-sided refusal to put the kingdom anywhere you could ever point to, including, and this is the part people miss, including inside your own skull. Now we come to the part of saying 3 that almost everyone skips, and it's the part that actually tells you how the thing is supposedly found. When you come to know yourselves, then you will be known, and you will understand that you are children of the living Father. The ancient Greek world had a famous version of this command carved over the entrance to the temple at Delphi. Gnothi Sauton, know thyself. It was one of the most celebrated maxims in the whole classical world. But watch what self-knowledge actually does in this saying, because it's not the same thing the modern world means by it. It isn't introspection for its own sake. It isn't taking stock of your personality, cataloging your traits, understanding your patterns. The result of knowing yourself, the saying says, is that you will be known by something or someone the text leaves unnamed, and that you will understand that you are children of the living Father. In other words, knowing yourself leads to understanding where you came from. Self-knowledge here, it's the same thing as origin knowledge. To truly know what you are is to recognize where you're from. And then comes the dark mirror image of that promise, and it is genuinely severe. But if you do not come to know yourselves, then you live in poverty. And you are that poverty. Sit for a second with how hard that lands. It does not say, if you don't know yourself, you will have less, you'll miss out, you'll be poorer than you could be. It says you are the poverty. The not knowing isn't a condition you suffer from, something you possess, like an illness. It is what you are in the absence of self-knowledge. The lack and the self-collapse into the same thing. To not know yourself is to be a kind of poverty walking around in human shape. This is the point where the Greek word gnosis, knowledge, earns its keep, and where Thomas brushes right up against the thing people loosely call Gnosticism, even though, as I was careful to say earlier, it doesn't carry the full system. Because the knowledge that matters here is not information. It's crucial that you feel this distinction. You cannot be told it and thereby have it. I cannot give it to you in this script. It isn't a fact that transfers from one mind to another. It's self-recognition. It's coming to know what you are and where you're from the inside, in a way that changes you. And the text frames that recognition as nothing less than the difference between living in poverty and realizing you're a child of the living Father, between being a kind of nothing and recognizing yourself as belonging to something. Now, scholars disagree, and reasonably so, about how literally to take that last phrase, children of the living Father. Is it a strong metaphysical claim that there's an actual divine spark in human beings, a genuine kinship of substance between the soul and God? That's the reading you'll find in some of the more mystical interpreters. Or Is it closer to the language of adoption, of belonging, of being claimed as a child, which runs all through early Christianity without necessarily implying that you're made of the same stuff as God? Thomas itself does not spell out the metaphysics. It states the experience, recognition, belonging, the end of a certain poverty, and it leaves the machinery underneath unexplained. And I genuinely ask you to resist the urge to fill in that machinery too quickly, in either direction. The text is more careful and more reticent than most of its interpreters. It tells you that knowing yourself ends your poverty and reveals your origin. It does not hand you a doctrine about the nature of that origin. The restraint is part of the meaning. Let me bring in a second saying now, because it locks the first one into place and shows you that we're not overreading a single line. This is saying 113, which comes near the very end of the whole collection. His disciples said to him, "When will the kingdom come?" Jesus said, "It will not come by watching for it." People will not say, "Look, here it is," or "Look, there it is." Rather, the kingdom of the Father is spread out across the earth, and people do not see it. Read saying 3 and saying 113 together, and a single coherent vision snaps into focus. In saying 3, the kingdom is inside you and outside you. In saying 113, the kingdom is spread out across the earth and people do not see it. These are the same teaching from two different angles. The kingdom is not coming. It is not late. It is not on its way from somewhere far off. It is not scheduled for the future. It is here already, distributed across ordinary reality the way light is distributed across a room. And the entire human problem, according to this text, is not distance and not timing. The problem is blindness. We do not see it. It's right here, spread out under our feet, and we walk over it. I want you to feel how radically this departs from the picture most people carry, even most people raised religious. The standard expectation, which you find across much of the New Testament and through most of the following 2,000 years of Christianity, is that the kingdom of God is a future event. It arrives, it breaks in from outside. There's a day the dead are raised, the world is judged, a new order is established, and until that day comes, you wait, and you watch, and you hope. Thomas looks at that entire framework and says, no, it's already spread out across the earth. The change that's needed is not a change in the cosmic timeline. It's not something God still has to do. The change that's needed is in your perception. The kingdom isn't waiting to arrive. You're waiting to see. And notice the exact phrasing of the warning in 113, because there's almost a paradox folded into it. It will not come by watching for it. There's something self-defeating built into the watching. The posture of scanning the horizon for signs, of waiting and looking for the kingdom to appear, is the very posture that prevents you from seeing what's already here. Which brings us, of course, all the way back around to the keys in your hand at the start. The search assumes absence. As long as you're scanning the sky and searching the sea, you are confirming to yourself with every scan that the thing is not here, not now, not in this. The looking, the watching, the waiting is itself the obstacle you cannot find by searching what was never lost. And the searching is precisely what keeps you from noticing that. There are a couple of nearby sayings that sharpen this even further, and I want to give them to you, because they're less famous and they deserve more air. Saying 5, Jesus said, "Know what is in front of your face, and what is hidden from you will be revealed to you. For there is nothing hidden that will not become manifest." Sit with that first line on its own. Know what is in front of your face. Not what is far off, not what is esoteric, not some buried secret you have to dig for. The thing in front of your face, the obvious, the present, the overlooked. And the claim is that if you truly come to know what's right in front of you, the hidden will open up to you on its own. The path to the hidden, in other words, runs directly through the obvious. We tend to assume the opposite. We assume the deep truth must be hidden, exotic, hard to reach, available only to initiates and seekers who travel far. Thomas keeps insisting that the deep truth is sitting on the surface of the ordinary, in front of your face, unseen precisely because it's too plain to look at. And if you want to know just how far Thomas pushes that idea, how concrete it's willing to get, Look at saying 77. It has two parts, and the contrast between them is the whole point. The first part is enormous, cosmic, almost overwhelming. A voice claims to be the light that is over all things, the all from which everything came and to which everything returns. That's about as grand and abstract as religious language gets. And then immediately the second part drops all the way down to the ground. Split a piece of wood and I am there. Lift up the stone and you will find me there. I love this saying for how stubbornly physical it is. Not I am in the temple, not I am enthroned in the highest heaven. Split a log, turn over a rock, the most ordinary, unspiritual, unremarkable objects you could possibly name. A piece of firewood, a stone lying on the path, and the claim is that the divine presence is right there, in the grain of the wood, under the rock you'd step over without a glance. It's the same teaching as 113, the kingdom spread out across the earth, but made tactile, made graspable. The kingdom isn't spread across the earth in some soft, poetic, gestural sense. It's in this specific stone, this specific log, the exact thing you would never, in 1,000 years, think to look at because it's far too plain to be holy. And here, honesty requires a small detour because I told you we'd read the actual text and not a polished fantasy of it. There's a real scholarly debate about saying 77, about whether those wood and stone lines originally belonged with the grand I am the light over all things lines, or whether they were two separate sayings that got joined together at some point in the text's long history. In the Greek, fragments from Oxyrhynchus, the wood and stone material, appears to attach to a different saying than it does in the Coptic. The seams, in other words, are visible. You can see in places where the text was stitched and restitched as it was copied and recombined across generations. And I point that out not to weaken the saying, but because pretending an ancient text is perfectly seamless, that it dropped from heaven in finished form, is itself a kind of disrespect to what it actually is. The seams are part of the truth of it. This is a real document with a real history, assembled by real human communities over real time. And the fact that you can still see the joins is part of what makes it worth trusting as a genuine artifact rather than a smooth invention. Now, I want to give you the saying I'd most want you to remember if you forgot everything else, because it's the bridge between all this cosmic talk about the kingdom and your actual specific life. Saying 70. Jesus said, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you." The Coptic of this one is difficult, and translators render it somewhat differently at the edges. Some say what you have, some what is within you, but the shape of it is unmistakable, and it's close to frightening in its symmetry. There is something within you. It is not neutral, it is not safe to ignore. If you bring it out, it saves you. If you leave it buried inside, it destroys you. The very same thing, the exact same inner content. And whether it rescues you or ruins you depends on one single variable, whether it gets brought forth or left in. Put that next to saying 3 and feel how they rhyme. Saying 3 said, if you don't know yourself, you are poverty. Saying 70 says, if you don't bring forth what's within you, what you leave buried will destroy you. These are two statements of one idea. Whatever this inner thing is, call it the divine spark if you want the Gnostic vocabulary. Call it your true self. Call it the kingdom within. Thomas does not treat it as automatically good news. And this is so important. It is not a comfort. It is not a warm reassurance that you're already fine just as you are. It's latent. It's a seed that has to be brought out, recognized, lived, expressed, or it rots inside you and turns destructive. The kingdom being inside you in this text is not a soft consolation. It's a responsibility with a real cost attached to neglecting it. The thing within you is not a possession, it's a demand. And there's a saying that gives you the actual texture of that inner transformation, saying 22, which is one of the densest in the whole collection. The disciples are watching some infants being nursed, and Jesus says these infants are like those who enter the kingdom. They ask, then shall we enter the kingdom as little children? And his answer spirals out into something strange and beautiful. He says, when you make the two into one, and when you make the inside like the outside, and the outside like the inside, and the above like the below, and when you make the male and the female into a single one, so that the male is not male and the female not female, then you will enter the kingdom. I'm compressing, but that's the heart of it. Listen to what's happening there. The whole saying is about collapsing oppositions. Making the two into one, making inside like outside. And that should ring a bell now because it's the same structure as saying three. Inside you and outside you. The kingdom isn't on one side of any of our familiar divisions. Inner versus outer, above versus below, this versus that. To enter it, the text says, is to stop living inside those divisions. To make the two into one. To heal the split between inside and outside that makes us search out there for what's in here, or search in here for what's out there. The division is the exile. The unity is the kingdom. And notice again that this isn't presented as a belief to adopt. It's presented as something you do, something you become. A making, an integration, a healing of a split. There's a cluster of sayings in the middle of the gospel, around 49 and 50 and 51, that adds the final piece, the question of origin. And I want to walk through it because it completes the picture. In saying 49, there's a blessing on those who are, in the text's language, solitary and chosen. And the reason given is striking. For you will find the kingdom because you come from it, and you will return to it again. You come from it. The kingdom isn't only spread out around you and inside you in the present. It's where you're from. It's your origin and your destination at once. And in saying 50, there's an almost cryptic instruction for what to say if you're asked where you came from. An answer about coming from the light, from the place where the light came into being of itself. Then saying 51, which I find quietly devastating. The disciples ask him, when will the rest of the dead, the repose, the new world come? And he answers, in effect, what you are waiting for has already come, and you do not recognize it. They're asking when the new world will arrive, and he's telling them it's already here, and they're standing in it without seeing it. It's saying 113 again, in a different key. The thing you're waiting for is not in the future. You're already inside it. You just don't have eyes for it yet. So step back and look at the whole pattern we've assembled across sayings 3, 5, 22, 49 through 51, 70, 77, and 113. The kingdom is not a future event, and it's not a distant place. It is inside you and outside you at once, spread across the ordinary world, present in firewood and in stones, in front of your face. You come from it and you'll return to it. The way to find it is self-knowledge, which is also origin knowledge, plus the bringing forth of what is latent within you, plus the collapsing of the divisions, inside and outside, that keep you searching on the wrong axis. And the single great obstacle to all of it is a way of looking, a posture of watching and waiting and scanning the horizon, that perpetually projects the kingdom elsewhere, and thereby guarantees you'll never notice it's already here. That much, I think. The text genuinely and consistently says the sayings really do rhyme with one another. They cohere, but now I have to be just as honest about the open questions as I've been confident about the connections, because intellectual honesty has to cut in both directions, or it isn't honesty at all. First, there's a real debate about meaning. Is Thomas teaching a genuine mysticism of inner transformation, a real path of self-knowledge that leads to an actual recognition of one's divine origin and a transformed way of perceiving the world? That's broadly how interpreters like Elaine Pagels have tended to read it, and it's a powerful and moving reading. Or is the self-knowledge language more modest than that, more squarely in line with older Jewish and early Christian wisdom traditions? And are the deeply mystical readings projecting later developments back onto an earlier and plainer text? Stephen Davies, for instance, argued that Thomas is fundamentally wisdom literature, in the lineage of books like Proverbs and the sayings of the sages, and that the grander cosmic and mystical readings overreach what's actually there. Both readings are genuinely defensible. The text is spare enough, reticent enough, to support more than one serious interpretation. And I'm not going to pretend my favorite is the only legitimate one. Second, There's a real debate about whether Thomas even has a single coherent theology to interpret. I've been reading these sayings as one teaching, weaving them together, 3 with 70, with 77, with 113. But if April de Comic's rolling corpus model is right, if this is a community's collection assembled and reassembled across generations, rather than one author's unified treatise, then I shouldn't expect perfect internal consistency. Because there isn't a single mind behind it, some sayings may pull against others. And if that's the case, then the move I just made, gathering these particular sayings into one elegant picture, is partly an act of interpretation on my part, a pattern I'm assembling, not simply a pattern I'm reporting. Now, I happen to think it's a fair assembly. These sayings really do echo one another in ways that are hard to dismiss as coincidence. But you deserve to know that I'm assembling, and that a different reader, emphasizing different sayings, could assemble a somewhat different Thomas. And third, there's the unresolved question of the relationship to the Gospels in your Bible. Did the author of Thomas know Luke's "the kingdom is within or among you" and deliberately rework it into "inside you and outside you"? Or are Thomas and Luke independently drawing on older sayings that were circulating before either of them was written down? As I mentioned, Mark Goodacre has argued strongly for dependence, that Thomas knows the Synoptic Gospels. Others have argued just as strongly for independence. And this isn't a dry technical matter, because the stakes are real. If Thomas is independent and early, then its version of "the kingdom is inside you and outside you" might bring us very close to something the historical Jesus actually taught, or at least to a very early layer of the tradition about him, possibly older than the form in Luke. And if Thomas is late and dependent, then it's a 2nd century reinterpretation, a later writer's creative development of material he already had. We do not know which it is. I genuinely wish I could tell you we did, but the evidence does not allow certainty, and the people who claim certainty in either direction are claiming more than they can support. So here is where all of that leaves us, and I want you to hold both halves of it at the same time, because holding both is the entire discipline of reading something this old, this honestly. The pattern across these sayings is, I'm convinced, real and remarkable. The kingdom is not a future event, and not a distant place. It is inside you and spread across the ordinary world. The way to find it is self-knowledge and the bringing forth of what's latent. And the great obstacle is a way of looking that keeps projecting the thing elsewhere. That much the text says with genuine and surprising consistency. What we do not get to know for certain is exactly how old the text is, precisely what metaphysics stands behind its language, and whether it gives us an independent line back to Jesus or a later and creative development of the tradition. The insight and the uncertainty are both real, and you don't have to choose between them. You can let the description move you and still hold the questions open. That, more than any single doctrine, is what I'd want you to take from how we've read this. Now let me step back out of the manuscript for a while, all the way out, back into a life you'd recognize, because underneath all of this ancient language, there's an experience I think is real, whether or not you accept a single theological claim in the Gospel of Thomas. Think about the last time you were certain, really certain, that your life would finally feel like living once you arrived somewhere. After the degree, after the move to the new city, after the relationship, the promotion, the number in the account that would finally mean you were safe, the version of yourself that finally at last had it together. There's a quiet and almost completely invisible assumption running underneath all of that, and most of us never notice we're making it. The assumption is that the real thing, the meaningful thing, the thing that will make us feel that we're actually here and actually alive, is up ahead, out there, in the future, on the far side of some arrival, and not, definitely not, in this particular ordinary Tuesday afternoon, with its dishes in the sink and its unanswered messages, and its commute and its plain unremarkable light coming in through the window. We scan the horizon of our own future, looking for the moment that will finally count, exactly the way the people in saying 3 scan the sky and the sea for a kingdom that was never in either. And here's the part that should genuinely give you pause, because most of us have lived long enough by now to have actually run the experiment more than once. You arrive, you get the thing. The degree comes, the move happens, the relationship begins, the number lands in the account, and there's a strange flatness right where the arrival was supposed to be. Not always, and not for everyone. And I don't want to overstate it, but often enough that it is one of the most reliably reported experiences in all of adult human life. The future you spent years living toward quietly becomes the present. And the present, it turns out, is the one place the feeling you were chasing stubbornly refused to live. And so, almost without noticing you're doing it, you relocate the feeling to the next horizon, the next arrival, the next someday, and you go on scanning the sky. And the birds, as the saying says, keep getting there first. I am not telling you this in order to now sell you the cure. I want to be very careful here. More careful than the rest of this corner of the internet tends to be, because the easy move, the move that's made constantly in videos that look a lot like this one, is to pivot right here and tell you that you, specifically, have a secret divine identity, that you are one of the rare awakened ones, that this video found you for a reason, that the fact you've made it this far proves something special about your soul. And I'm not going to do any of that. I'm not going to do it because I don't know what you are, and the text doesn't tell me what you are, and flattering you would be a way of doing to you the exact thing those leaders in Saying 3 do, pointing you toward an elsewhere, toward a special status out ahead of you, instead of toward what's already here, under your feet, in your hands. The flattery is just another sky to scan. It's another way of being told the good thing is somewhere you currently are not. So here is what I'll offer instead, and it's smaller, and I think it's more honest. The description in Thomas that the thing we keep chasing is not in the future and not in the elsewhere, that it's spread out across the ordinary earth and inside us at the same time. And that the reason we don't see it is the very posture of searching for it. That description is worth sitting with, quietly, whether or not you accept the framework it comes wrapped in. You do not have to believe in a living Father, you do not have to believe in a divine spark or a Coptic gospel or anything at all to test the central claim against your own life. Because the claim is, in part, simply empirical. It says, the meaning you keep postponing into the future is, at least sometimes, already fully present in the very moment you're treating as nothing more than a means to some better moment later. And that is something you can actually check. You're the only instrument in the world that can check it. No one can run that experiment for you, and no one can run it on you. And here's the thing I find genuinely haunting, the thing that keeps me coming back to this text. When people do catch it, when they have one of those strange, unbidden moments, where the ordinary world goes suddenly transparent, where a kitchen at 6 in the evening, or a stranger's face on a train, or a patch of afternoon light moving slowly across a wall, becomes for no reason at all, briefly and almost unbearably enough, completely sufficient, lacking nothing. They almost never describe it afterward as something they achieved. They never say they earned it, or built it, or worked their way up to it. They describe it as something they noticed. It was already there. They happened for a moment to stop searching long enough to see it, split the wood, lift the stone. It was right there in the grain, under the rock in front of their face the entire time. I don't know what that experience is. I want to be honest about that to the very end. I'm not going to pretend that the Gospel of Thomas explains it, or that a 4th century Coptic manuscript pulled out of a jar in Egypt is the secret key that unlocks it. I don't believe that, and I won't tell you it. But I do notice something, and the noticing is enough to keep me reading. I notice that a text written nearly 2,000 years ago is describing the very same structure that those people describe. The thing is already here. The looking elsewhere is the problem. The seeing is a kind of knowing what you are. That correspondence, across 2,000 years and an entire dead language, doesn't prove anything. It's not evidence in any strict sense. But it is not nothing either. It's exactly the kind of thing worth being quiet in front of for a while, without rushing to turn it into a doctrine or a product, or a flattering story about how special you must be to have heard it. So if there's something here worth exploring, what would exploring it actually look like, drawn specifically from this text and not from the generic toolkit that gets handed out everywhere? Most contemplative practices, you'll ever be offered aim, in the end, at calm, Settle the breath, quiet the mind, release the tension, arrive at stillness and peace. And there's nothing wrong with calm, but I want to offer you something that the Gospel of Thomas actually points toward, and what's interesting is that it's almost the opposite of calm, which is exactly why I think it's worth your attention. Saying 2 of Thomas describes a sequence, a kind of map of how seeking is supposed to feel as it unfolds. In plain rendering, it runs something like this: whoever seeks should not stop seeking until they find. And when they find, they will be disturbed or troubled. And when they are disturbed, they will be amazed, astonished, and then they will reign over all. Look closely at the order of that. The disturbance comes after the finding, not before it. You'd expect a spiritual text to promise that seeking leads to peace. This one says, seeking leads to finding, and finding leads to being troubled. And only on the far side of being troubled does astonishment wait. The disturbance is not a failure of the practice. It is not a sign you're doing it wrong. It's a stage of the process, a doorway you have to actually pass through. Most methods on offer try to dissolve your perplexity as quickly as possible. Thomas treats perplexity as the necessary threshold, the thing you have to walk through to reach the amazement on the other side. So here is something you might try, offered in that spirit as an experiment rather than an instruction, and on no particular schedule, with no urgency attached to it whatsoever. Take a single ordinary thing, and I mean ordinary, the opposite of sacred. Not a candle, not a symbol, not anything that already comes preloaded with meaning. A glass of water sitting on the table, the grain of a wooden floor, the backs of your own hands. Pick something so completely plain that you would normally never give it a second look in your entire life. And then, instead of trying to feel calm about it or peaceful around it, or to empty your mind near it, do something harder. Hold a single question against it and refuse to answer the question too quickly. The question is, roughly, what if the thing I keep looking elsewhere for is not actually absent from this? Not as a belief you're trying to adopt, not as a feeling you're trying to manufacture. As a genuine, open, slightly uncomfortable question held against this very plain object, and then let it do what saying 2 promises it will do. Let it unsettle you, let it actually trouble you a little the way a real question troubles you, the kind you can't immediately resolve. Because saying 2 tells you the unsettling is the point, that the disturbance is not the obstacle but the path, and that astonishment lives on the far side of being troubled, never on the near comfortable side of it. You're not breathing in any special pattern. You're not visualizing light pouring through your body. You're not chasing bliss or calm or peace. You're doing something much plainer and much harder and much closer to what this text actually describes. You're letting one ordinary object refuse to stay safely ordinary, and you're staying with the disturbance that follows for long enough to find out what, if anything, is waiting on the other side of it. And some of the time, maybe most of the time, nothing will happen. And the glass will just be a glass, and the floor will just be a floor, and that is completely fine. The practice is not a machine that dispenses experiences on demand. Explore it because you're curious what's actually there, not because anyone, least of all me, has promised you what you'll find. The curiosity is the whole posture. The not knowing is the honest part. I'll let the text itself do the closing because it says the thing better than I possibly could. When the disciples in saying 113 ask when the kingdom will come, they are asking the single most natural question a human being can ask. We are creatures who live almost entirely inside the word when. After this. Once that happens, someday, when things settle down, when I finally arrive, it's how we organize a whole life. And the answer those disciples get is not a date, it is not later or soon or at the end of the age. The answer is that the question itself has the wrong shape. It will not come by watching for it. It is already spread out across the earth. And people do not see it. So I'm not going to ask you to do 3 things before you go. I'm not going to tell you to subscribe before the kingdom slips away, or to type some special phrase in the comments to prove what kind of soul you are, or to act right now before the moment passes. None of that, because all of it would just be one more sky for you to scan, one more elsewhere I'd be pointing you toward when the entire weight of everything we've read points exactly the other way? Instead, I'll just leave you with the disciples' question, turned very slightly. Not when will it come, but this. What would you have to stop doing in order to notice what's already here? Sit with that one for a while. It's older than both of us, and it isn't finished with anyone yet.